mentioned there the gap that we're currently in a recessionary gap. You will have to draw some of those gaps, and so you had the worksheet, and we introduced the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. One of the things to remember there is that if we have an inflationary gap, GDP, the actual GDP, where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect, that is going to be the actual GDP is going to be greater than the potential. That's an inflationary gap, which means unemployment would be less than the natural rate. Because we're producing so much, we've got to hire up more workers. And so that's going to put unemployment down below the natural rate. Remember, that's something that we can't really sustain over the long run. A lot of times people say, hey, that's great, GDP's up, that's great. But if GDP is above our capacity, we can't sustain that in the long run, only in the short run. Eventually, that's going to lead to more inflation, and the economy will move back to the potential. And that's why it was so important when we talked about economic growth, that we talked about our potential changing. Because if you really want your economy to grow, you've got to increase your potential, not just increase GDP or above potential, because you can't sustain that. All right, so you got those gaps. Remember that relationship, that inverse relationship between unemployment and GDP, so that you can recognize, given the information, what the gap is that you need to draw when you draw that aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, let me just check off all the things I wanted to get to, the numbers, and we talked about the gaps and the natural rate of unemployment. All right, the next thing that I want to touch on here is GDP, the definition. Gross domestic product, what's the definition? You know what? This is no secret. You know that definition is going to be on there. And you really have to know this definition inside and out, because this definition is what's going to help you understand what's included or what's not included in GDP. I mean, it's all in the definition. That definition is going to be on the big quiz, and it's going to be worth 7 points. 7 points. Okay? So you got to have that down. Gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time or in a given year. Okay? So, got to have that definition down. You know, when I was teaching at the University of Hawaii, I used to call that the fatal question. I used to tell them if they missed that, they automatically fail the class. Okay? And so this is a pretty big one. But 7 points, I think that's big enough. Okay, so make sure you get that one down. As far as the definition too, you know, one of the other things is you guys looked at different methods of calculating, and we had an income approach where we looked at, let's add up all the income, because what we know from the circular flow diagram is all the spending in the economy is equal to all the income in the economy. And so we saw that when we looked at the circular flow diagram, we looked at the Mickey Mouse version of it. Spending equals income, and that income we could add up wages, interest, rent, and profit. Remember, WIRP. But then we could also add up all the spending. And the categories of spending were C, I, G, and NX, Signex. Okay? And so those are a couple of ways to do it. And also, you guys looked at the value-added approach. That is to say, hey, a farmer goes out and grows some wheat, and that wheat's worth $200, sells it to the mill. And the mill then takes that wheat and produces $300 worth of flour. So when we look at that, how much value was added by the mill? The answer is $100, because they bought $200 worth of wheat. Then they made it into flour, and now it was worth $300. So they added $100. Now, if we take a step back, though, and look at the farmer grew that wheat and added value of $200. Okay? So we could go through each step. Now the mill sells it to the bakery, and the bakery bakes bread that's worth $600. That means that since they bought flour worth $300, they made the bread, they value added was $300. Now, we could go through each step. $200 added by the farmer, $100 added by the mill, $300 added by the bakery, and then add up those values. Now, that's really kind of a philosophical approach, because that would take a lot of time, a lot of energy. When, in fact, if you look at the definition, we're going to include the value of all final goods and services. So count the $600 in the bread, and guess how you get the $600? 200 plus 100 plus 300. The value added along the way. So counting the final goods is a way that we can simplify the approach to calculating GDP. So you guys looked at that. But now, thinking back to that circular flow diagram that we referred to, you got to remember, it's not about memorizing that diagram. In fact, if you remember when we did a simplified version of that back in the first quarter, we changed it all the time, and it was, do you understand the relationships? And again, that's the key. Do you understand the relationships? What do households do with their money? Some of that money they use for consumption, and some of it they use to save, and that goes into the financial markets. Where does that money go? That goes back because they lend it to the investors, they lend it to the businesses, and they spend it on investment. So it comes back into the spending flow. Then we get the government, and it's spending on goods and services. Because remember, some of the stuff is not goods and services. Some of the money that the government spends, when they spend money on welfare, Social Security, that's simply a transfer payment. No good or service was produced, thus not included in GDP. And then we have spending going out to the rest of the world. Households, businesses, government, we buy stuff that's produced in other countries, so that's import spending. And then we have this money that other countries spend buying U.S. goods and services, so that comes into the flow. That's the spending on exports. So exports gets added in, imports get subtracted out, exports minus imports, that's our net exports. Okay, so remember those relationships in the circular flow diagram. Don't just memorize and go, I know what this diagram is. Know what the diagram illustrates. That's the most important thing. Okay, now that's going to take us to a point where I want to talk about some categories here. I'm going to just take a quick break here, and then we'll get another video up. You guys check that one out.